Hi everyone, welcome back. Hello, I am very happy to welcome Zakaria Djebara today. And Zakaria Djebara is a postdoc at Aalborg University and is currently engaged with understanding the relation between architectural affordances, sensory-motor brain dynamics, and embodied condition by an experimental approach. To this end, Zach is committed to enactivism, neurophenomenology, and active inference as a philosophical point of departure in questioning what shapes the experience of architecture.
Mhm.
In this regard, Zach uses mobile EEG to analyze how architectural affordances are reflected in brain dynamics.
Yes,
Zakaria, welcome. How would you like to start?
thank you thank you very much for that nice introduction. I don't know exactly how to start. I have a small presentation, but I was kind of hoping that this presentation was not like a lecture, you know, so it would be like more fluent with some discussions popping up here and there, and I have a couple of diagrams to show as well, and maybe some perhaps unusual claims that could spark some discussion. I don't know.
Some interesting discussion and maybe some hot seat questions.
Could be, actually. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just thinking of this as a very relaxed conversation.
Yes. No, I just meant it also for fun. It's not my intention to lure you to a place and squeeze you. That's that's not the whole point. Okay, so I have shared my screen now. So whenever you would like to show some information or some slides, you can start.
Well, just give me a second real quick. You can still hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, let's see. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, sure.
It should be this one.
Yeah. Can everybody see it?
Yes. Is that a yes?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Okay, so I actually was thinking, what should I bring to these young students in terms of what should we discuss? And I was thinking perhaps to bring something that has troubled my mind, at least for quite some time. And it has to do with shaping human experience. And I think that because as an architect, I am not so interested in just understanding the underlying works. I want to understand how I can shape it. I want to sort of be in control. And I think that this is kind of what I am looking for, at least, looking for tools, looking for important factors that shape the human experience. And I think that one of the most important, let's say, processes here would be the unconscious, in my opinion. And I think that to me, I just start with a lot of assumptions and I go kind of backwards. And I think this is what can perhaps spark some interesting discussions in terms of the science. So I don't know if I said that, but my background is an architect, but also with an engineering background too. So sort of what they call an architectural engineer, I suppose. And as an architect, I learned the language of art and culture, of expression, of creativity. But also as an engineer, I operate in the language of math and structure and physics. So this is also like aspects that I'm definitely very, very interested in. But before I sort of get into the talk, I want to invite all the students, or actually everyone who's basically listening to this talk. I want you to just try to imagine, and I'm sure that because you're mostly designers who's listening, definitely the students. So I'm sure that they're all equipped with a nice pen, a nice piece of paper next to them right now. If not, then maybe there's something wrong. But what I want to invite you to do is to basically design a place to live for either a fish or a bird. And now this is not something that I want you to do like immediately. I want you just to scribble along the way as we talk. And perhaps at the end, we can just talk about what you ended up with. And now that I think of it, it should not just be a place to live for either a fish or a bird. I think that it could be anything. Could be clothes, could be couch, a place to sit, a place to lay, a place to relax, anything really. Could be also like front doors, whatever, just something. And I'm sure that you all can like sort of multitask, because as a student myself, I did that a lot during all the lectures. So I'm sure that you can all scribble along the way. But anyway, so to me, I started out with trying to understand the human experience, and it was obvious for me that this has a lot to do with sensing, right? So we're sensing our environment, and the whole process of sensing, I mean, the very fact that we're sensing is systems and mechanisms that are anchored in the body. So to me, it was like a no-brainer, especially if you want to do, if you want to have a biological approach to human experience. You end up with basically discussing the structure of the body. And once you get there, you start realizing that your sensory apparatus, your sensory system, and the way that you act in the environment are inherently related to a degree that they might not even be separable. And this is where embodied cognition introduces the trinity, you could call it, the triad, the brain-body-environment bidirectional interaction, so that the brain has an impact on the body and on the environment, but also the other way around. And it's quite interesting, because as soon as you start realizing that all this sensing and perception and action are all sort of interlaced, you start realizing that, okay, so in order to understand the origin of perception, you need to understand these building stones. At least that's a good point of departure, I'd argue. And when you realize that, you start thinking, okay, so how is human experience then related to perception, for example? And can cognitive neuroscience, and I'm talking about cognitive neuroscience in particular, because this is a field that studies a lot the interaction between the brain and the environment. And only recently has it become, has people started, like researchers started to really include the body. But usually it had a lot more to do with the brain and the environment. There is some sound popping, there is some stimuli popping over here, something over there. And it's usually this type of interaction that people care about. So can cognitive neuroscience inform architects in designing human experience? What I mean by this question is, can we actually look into their papers and learn how should we design the experience? And then, of course, there is also some assumption in these type of questions. Can architects design human experience? Can we at all do this? Is it just something that we think we can, but we actually can't? And then the question becomes also, what's essential in human experience? What's the role of the environment in human experience? And can cognitive neuroscience reveal anything about human experience? And all of these questions, I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to answer any of these questions. They're super difficult questions, but it sort of maps out the territory of this research. That's why I think that they're important. So what I want to just briefly introduce is a claim, or maybe you could say an assumption for my part. To start from something that I understand and that I know, right? And I believe that experience is continuous, that we experience the world continuously, which means that our experience is about the dynamics. And here I would just like to introduce this small diagram here, which originally comes from Edmund Husserl, some would say the father of phenomenology, German philosopher. And basically this model, which I hope that you guys can see here, can you see my laser point?
Yeah, we can.
Yes, great. I would just like to quickly explain this model that I'm very fond of. I think every time I have to make some kind of presentation, I bring it. But basically, if you imagine that this line here is the arrow of time and experience. So we basically jump from an event C to the event D and so on, EFG. But at each event, there are something that Husserl coined as protension. And basically a protension is the immediate expectation. It's nothing like the cognitive process of expecting something, right? It's not like someone is pregnant and then you expect a baby in 9 months. This is a very cognitive and conscious expectation. These are more immediate, right? So these are called protension. And at point D, you have a protension, which is here P, of the event E, which is next up. At the same time, you also have some protension of the event F, which is much further away. And as you keep climbing this axis, things get weaker and weaker. You have a weaker expectation of the coming event, right? But you also, the other way around, have something called retention. And I think this is much more acclaimed word today. So it basically means what you have just experienced. Like when you listen to a melody, you still feel like there's part of the tones that are still hanging in your ears. That would be the retention. It's not like really a memory of that. It's just something that sticks to your current experience. So basically, if you take here, for example, point E, the event E, which is basically in the middle and is a good point of departure to explain this. Our current experience encompasses.
I'm done.
Sorry?
Or maybe you say, no, my building's a CMU building. And so I got a CMU building.
Lily, excuse me, you should mute your phone.
That's not me.
That's my detail. I'm done. Okay.
I'm sorry. I would ask everyone in the audience to please mute the phone.
You know, Maria, you can mute everybody. There's a thing where you can mute everybody.
Everyone is actually muted by default, but for some reason. Okay, so I'm sorry about that, Zach. Can we continue?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I think I just I lost it. Was there a question or something? I forgot. I completely forgot to tell you guys. You can just ask along the way.
No, there was some interference with the voice, but I also don't know. Yeah, please continue.
Okay, great. But yeah, like I said, just please interrupt whenever you want. Yeah, so I think that at this point here is where I left. Take point E. So our current experience would encompass both the retention and the protension of that particular event. What does this mean? This has serious implications for the way that we should understand a current experience, right? This means that there is part of the immediate expectation of the future, but also immediate retention of the past in a single experience. I think that this is fascinating, the way that it's basically formalized. And also, I should mention that Husserl really had a lot of issues. If you read the original manuscript, you can see that this model basically is redesigned every time. The problem here is that the relation between space and time, they go against each other, right? They're counterintuitive. The moment that he tries to define the present, he basically defines it in space, and he loses that, because then that dot or that line he draws is already some kind of entity itself, right? So he struggled with this. And I also think that there is some small comment at the end of the manuscript about this final model too, where he says that it's not a precise model at all. It's just a working model to explain his idea about how time evolves and how we experience the current, the present, basically. So what this says is that we are never without a prior experience, and we are never without some kind of expectation to the future. And this totally makes sense. If to give you an example, the typical example is that when you have like a cup or something along those lines, when you have an object or whatever, you don't always see the backside, but you still understand that there exists a backside, right? And this is like an expectation that is very implicit. It's not like you have to formalize the idea of this is on the backside. To give an architectural example, once you are in a space, you understand the way that you have to navigate space immediately. It's not like you need to be consciously there to understand this is how I should move from that place to that place, and so on and so on. There's some kind of implicit grasp, right? And the amazing why I love this model here is that the way that it connects the sensory system and the action, right? The motor system. Basically, the theory goes that the reason that we understand the backside of any object is because we know the motor execution to bring that perception up, right? I know exactly what to do in order to get the perception that I need So it's a very practical way of understanding perception. So in my opinion, with this very simple diagram, okay, maybe it's not so simple, but with this diagram, there is some kind of relation between the sensory system and the motor system, right? The motor system has to do with the way that you have some kind of, you generate pretensions about the upcoming events. And then these retentions, they are basically sensory echoes. So we are constantly enacted in the sense that we constantly try to find out, how can I interact with anything in space, any object in space? So in light of temporality, we act to perceive. And therefore, our sensory system is an active process. To perceive is an active process. And this is basically what I'm trying to pull out from here. And perhaps I should have brought some references to all of this, because this idea has been further elaborated, which I think into a quite detailed theoretical framework by Alva Noe and Kevin O'Regan, called the sensory motor contingency theory. And basically it has to do with how sensory systems are contingent on motor systems and the other way around. So basically they inform each other in that sense. The radical claim by them is, of course, that the perceptual experience is a sensory motor skill that we can exercise. And I will not take it that far right now. Instead, what I would like to do is basically to contrast two things. I would like to talk about perceptual capacities and sensing capacities, and talk about the need of consciousness for that kind. So I like to think about this in a certain way. So we just learned that sensory systems, that is not the perception of something, right? Basically, when you sense something, when you drive a car and you follow, you're driving the highway and you follow behind one car, you don't need to perceive and consciously understand that I need to stick behind this car. You just mind wander. You start thinking about what to cook when you get home. You start to think about what should you read when you get home, right? You look forward to this presentation, stuff like that. And basically, all of these, let's say, processes, they don't need conscious, like the interference of consciousness. This is something that goes by completely unconscious, right? So our sensing capacities, they don't need consciousness in that sense. We can easily track anything without thinking about it consciously. So these sensing capacities, what I like to sometimes also, and I think that this can maybe create some kind of confusion, but basically these sensory motor skills is basically what attune us to the world, right? So the way that we understand the world has a lot to do with those two simple processes, that is sensory system and motor system. And this attunement is what reflects the affordances. And I've talked about affordances before, and I've not used the word insofar, right? I've just used it now. It's because I'm trying to do it the other way around. I'm trying to explain affordances from the other way around. And I try to explain how the sensory system is contingent on the motor system in that sense. So what are affordances? And I've taken here a quotation from Andy Clark, the philosopher who is behind predictive processing, inspired by free energy principle and so on. And basically, he defines affordances as the possibilities for use, intervention, and action which the physical world offers a given agent, and are determined by the fit between the agent's physical structure, capacities, and skills, and the action-related properties of the environment itself. And this is basically what we just tried to sum up with that model. There's no questions so far.
I have a lot of questions, but I will save them for our conversation, for when we will talk a little bit about them.
Super. All right. I'm looking forward. Okay, so basically here is the claim. It becomes that ongoing predictions are what are shaping our experience, and I think that this is a very serious claim. I think that this has a lot of implications in the way that we should think about architecture. Could it really be that? Is it really the predictions about how we can interact with space before we even get there that shapes our experience? Well, if this is the case, right? If this is the case, and now this is why I'm asking here, why are affordances so important to understand in the context of human experience? The thing is that if affordances are so important to our perception, to our experience of space, then we should expect that motor capacities are reflected in perceptual processes. I don't know if that was too clumsy formulated, but basically what I'm saying is that we should expect to find traits of affordances in our perceptual processes in the brain, right? I hope this makes sense. I'm trying to really cut off all the excessive stuff and really remove all the detail. Basically what I'm saying is that the affordance of space, how well you fit the space, your body and the environment, the possible interaction should be reflected in that person's perceptual processes.
Mhm.
And this is exactly what I set out to experiment with. I should mention, by the way, that as much as I like theory, as much as I love philosophy, psychology, and so on, I'm very experimental. I like to do empirical stuff. I like to experiment. I like to measure, and of course there are so many limitations to this, so many aspects of experience that you simply cannot measure. And in fact, I'm doing a lot of assumptions here. For example, that perceptual processes that are basically the underlying. I'm basically saying that perceptual processes are underlying experience, human experience, and I'm saying that these are measurable in the brain. This might completely be wrong.
Well,
I mean,
I do have a question. Yeah, related to that. So there's a cultural overlay to perception of affordances, right? Which is not necessarily found in the brain, or maybe are you saying it? A cultural, socio-cultural influence then somehow makes its way to the brain.
Yeah.
So sensory.
I would have some questions about this also, Zakaria, because
Yeah.
I think that in many ways, perhaps we can't be so deterministic. Also because, you know, besides being an architect and researcher who also works with these topics, I'm a performance artist. And I think that everyone who is interested and drawn to performance art tends to be kind of disobedient. So if you think about that an architect is someone who is trying to consciously really configure the exact experience that a user is going to have to the space, in how far are we interfering with the user's decision making in a way that actually maybe you're not serving the user's needs, but you're instructing the user to perform certain actions which you designer think are best for them. And we know that this was basically the motto of a lot of architecture which was done with the modern movement. We had Le Corbusier was doing these guidelines with the modular and so on. And he was looking for this scientific aesthetics, which was basically a way to control how people would use space. And this kind of theory was also behind a lot of really fascist architecture, which was done not just in Germany, but also by the Soviets, the communists. So just to bring it that there's also some ethical implications that we
absolutely
discuss.
And
and also I just wanted to say that when you say you're not about the theory and empirical, so empiricists tend to use theory differently than other people, right? So it's not that you don't love theory, or wait, I'm saying that those two things are not necessarily against each other. An empiricist tries to prove or disprove a theory in a causal relationship, which you've identified relationships that may not be causal, but are interactive or relational. And I think when you say, so your use of theory is to prove it, whereas not an empiricist, but maybe an interpretivist or a constructivist would be to seek to create theory. And on that note, I would say that I would go back to Gibson. I don't know why you didn't give Gibson's definition of affordance. Why did you use Clark? I mean, maybe, I don't know why, but Gibson, who coined the term, and he was this constructivist, and actually he was coming up to the term affordance because that word didn't exist. So I would actually go back to, so I don't know, I have many questions on multiple levels, but I'm very much enjoying your talk. So please continue.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
I would also like to add, Zakaria, that my perhaps a bit provocative questions are just to fuel the discussion. So
there's no such thing, Maria. I appreciate that. I think that this is like this is exactly what science is for. You need to come up with provocative questions. You need to come up with some questions that can actually spark more research.
I would just like to add something that I thought about these questions also because I read the papers that you sent to us to prepare. So I kind of could understand the methodology used in the experiments, and perhaps you could talk a little bit more about how you designed these experiments.
Yes, of course. I'm coming to that now, because basically what I found out here is that if this is the case, right? If this is the case that affordances are really that important to human experience, according to all of these theories, then basically I should be able to find traces of affordance characters in perceptual processes. And as I said, this is exactly what I went out to do. And I realized after sending these papers out to you, Maria, that perhaps they are a bit too complicated to understand for design students.
Well, for design students probably, but they are here and they should.
Yes, I will.
They read them, so they shall also make their questions.
Yeah, exactly. But you know what? I will just I will elaborate a little bit on the experiment and what we did in this experiment. So basically, we systematically altered the affordances of transitions. Basically, you go from one space to another, and there is a door in between, and this door changes in size for each trial. So basically, you start up with like a black sphere around your head, and you can't see anything. It's all in virtual reality, by the way. And you are equipped with an EEG setup that is mobile, so we can measure brain activity. Super noisy, of course. It's mobile EEG. And basically, what we did is people see a transition, people see a door, and there are three types of doors. There is one that is super wide and easily passable, and there's another one which is tight but still passable, and they learn that after a couple of tries. And then there is one that is completely impossible to pass, and this one they also learned that it's impossible to pass. And basically what we did was to measure the moment that they perceive this, and there you can get like these potentials of the brain. The brain basically sort of responds to whatever it's processing. And of course, there are also a lot of criticism towards this type of analysis. What do ERPs really reflect? But anyhow, of course, we interpret these results aligned with the existing literature, and we found, quite interestingly, that affordances are reflected in the early perceptual processes, right? And this is super interesting. Okay, so basically what we have is that perceptual processes are sensitive to affordances, to the potential interaction. Well, then the question is, are we really all that predictive? And I found this super interesting. And basically here you have maybe a better paradigm diagram. Basically you start in one space here, and then the sphere basically pops, and you see the door that you have to interact with. And then the door either turns green or red. In this case, it turns green. And then we asked our participants to go into the other room to pick the red circle in virtual reality, and then go back to the original space. And then basically they click this joystick, and they are starting a new trial. So it turns out that an important, I wouldn't say conclusion, but it definitely points in that direction, is that we have embodied predictions that occur during perception, right? So I thought, okay, this is at least some part of evidence to this claim then. And I continued then. Only recently did I publish this coming paper here, I will show. And it has to do with, well, then what other traits are there about affordances in the brain? And of course, I thought we should look into frequencies. And there are a lot of oscillations going on in the brain. So basically the ongoing oscillations, there are a lot of them. They have different purposes, and people are still debating about quite intensively about their purpose. What do they really reflect? Why do we even have them? And it remains unknown still. And like I think Lily just discussed before, there are a lot of correlations, but causality is well, I think this depends on your point of departure in philosophy, whether you believe in causality or not.
Zakaria, maybe you could give us a little more insight into what actually these graphics represent in a more tangible way.
These, or you mean the frequencies?
Both, actually, because
okay, sorry.
Our students, they had no contact with this kind of technology, so for them this graphic is a complete abstraction.
People, please ask if there's something you don't understand on the screen, unmute yourself. All right, so basically what you have here, I took one example out, is called the, so basically you have a lot of channels, like electrodes sticking to your head. And as they're looking at the environment, and you remember the black sphere just popped, right? And basically looking at a door. So the moment that this black sphere pops, we measure the brain activity, and there are these responses, perceptual processes, because you have to process what's going on in the environment. And basically what we found out was that the process for, in this case, the blue curve you see here represents the narrow door, which is the door that you cannot pass. And basically in our experiment, we found that in the cases where you can pass, although they are two different environments, the brain responds in the perceptual processes in the brain respond more or less in the same way. There were no significant differences in them. The only place that we found significant difference is in the case of the narrow door. And we're talking about already the significant differences at around 50 milliseconds. 50 milliseconds is super fast. We have an idea that people become conscious around 300 milliseconds. This is also something that is debated, of course. But there is some kind of I wouldn't say consensus, but a lot of agreement that this is around 300 milliseconds that you actually become conscious of what are you perceiving. We're talking about 50 milliseconds. There is already an affordance-related response in the brain. Yeah. So this channel that I found here is called the FCZ, and basically is at the center of the head, front to the center, and is basically right over the motor cortex. And no, perhaps I should say, let's just say the motor cortex for now. So it has to do with the area, the region of the brain that has to do with the motor system.
Zakaria, I have a question, just because it comes now in the flow. And I also did some experiments with emotion measurement, although I didn't use brain monitoring. I didn't have an EEG. So it was airflow and heartbeat and electrodermal activity. So these were the measurements that I used. But one thing that I could kind of immediately understand was that these measurements were also highly affected by the fact that the participants knew that they were in an experiment. So yes. I think that in this case, the perception of affordances, maybe it might be boosted somehow, or the brain's disposition to detect the affordances might be more attuned or alert because the person knows that it's an experiment. And so they are more sensitive to the cues of the environment, which is an environment they don't know because they don't yes. know how the room was designed.
As much as I agree with you, I would have to say that we would expect the differences for all the conditions then, because in all conditions they knew that they were an experiment, right? So in this case, you would expect also to find differences for the mid-size and the big size door, but they were both passable, and we did not find any significant differences. Mm-hmm. So this is, but I agree with you. I definitely think that when people know that they are in an experiment, you have very limited access to what's actually happening. I mean, to their experience. You have access to all other parts of you have access to different processes, but to their, like, let's say, perceptual experience, we don't really have access to that, right? So we don't know exactly what are we measuring. We have an idea because they did this 240 times each.
So basically what you mean is that this kind of measurement is useful because we can understand kind of independently if it's an experimental setting or not, but we can see through the measurements that there is a direct way to see that how the affordances are perceived, and there is an expression in the brain that reflects that there is a perception of affordances.
Yes, exactly. And what's interesting about this result, in my opinion, I mean, of course, this will spark a lot of interesting debates. It already did a lot at our department, at least. But this is interesting also from a cognitive science perspective. It basically shows that we are sensitive to the affordances already at the perceptual level. So, and again, this is why I jumped over to the oscillations part, because I think that this is then I started looking into the oscillations and to the frequencies that are occurring in the brain to understand, well, okay, let's look at the continuous experience, because at the moment where I looked at the ERP, the graph that you saw is basically a snapshot, right? It's a planned moment. It's a determined moment. I know when this black sphere pops. right? I know exactly when it does, and I can map all their brain activity and I can look at it. But if you look at the frequencies, and I should just quickly explain about these frequencies. So imagine these electrodes, they're basically measuring a lot of synaptic activity in the brain. And it looks like, it looks something like this. This is just something I took out from my data. And basically you can filter this. Basically filtering means that you try to extract certain frequencies and then you remove the rest. So in this case, there are already predefined frequencies. And I tried to put the most popular ones here. I'm still missing, I think, one delta. It would be about theta, and I think there's nothing higher than gamma anyway. But basically, you can extract these frequencies, and you will see that you can do a lot of different analysis with them. And like I said before, correlations are being mapped with these frequencies. For example, the researchers find that when people are more attentive to something, they find an increased alpha band activity. So this is just correlation. I'm not saying that it's causing it, and we also don't know which way the causality is going, whether someone wants to be attentive and then they produce the alpha, or the other way around. The alpha occurs and then they become more attentive. I will not dig into that debate, because I think for one, it's not really useful to architects, and two, it's way too complicated to cover in this talk.
Zakaria, just one thing, because now it also popped to my mind. So when you're talking at this moment about attention, do you make a distinction between focus or this kind of immersive attentive flow? Do you know what I mean? Like the difference between being very concentrated studying to learn a certain subject, like studying for an exam and so on, or playing, which is another way of being very attentive, with a lot of attention.
Yes, I completely understand. And also, in fact, in my paper, the recent paper, I also argued that attention is a misused concept. I think that people who talk about attention, and no one really knows what attention is. And I think that Paul Sisek, or I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but he really made a compelling paper where he really, really well argued that no one really knows what attention is. It's completely confused with awareness, focused attention, and basically the attention people talk about when they say, hey, look there, and people look at it and they're attentive to something. So there are certainly different kinds of attention. My point here is basically that there are these whatever definitions of attention that have been linked with the certain frequencies, they have been correlated with it. And I think this is, for now, this is the only this is the argument that I wanted to reach, right? Certain frequencies are linked with certain cognitive capacities. So in my experiment, I started thinking, maybe there is something about the frequencies when people are walking towards the door, right? So depending on the different affordances of the door, perhaps I will find different kinds of frequencies. And I started looking into what would it even mean. Let's say that I did find something like that. What would it mean? Well, it would mean, for example, if you have a stronger alpha, if you have stronger alpha activity when you approach a door that seems hard to pass, then you're basically changing the state of the body just before they pass into the next space. And of course, coming from an inactive and embodied cognition point of departure, it would mean that we are changing how this person will experience the next space. We're basically changing the prior experience. We are already designing the retention before they come to the event of the next space. Does it make sense? What I'm trying to say?
It makes sense, but now I became a little skeptical at
one
point, because I'm thinking, for example, in terms of neurodiversity. Do you think that it's really possible to extrapolate such a conclusion? Because there might be people who, for certain reasons, would find it really pleasant to go through the narrow door, and while perhaps the majority of people would prefer to go through the normal door, so to say. So in how far can we really correlate these reactions to establish some kind of normative behavior?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. But actually, I did pick up some emotional ratings, and I found out that people felt more dominated and they felt less excited when they had the narrow door, and that was very clear in the questionnaire. So I suppose, again, this is very difficult to say. I mean, it's very difficult to say anything concrete and very conclusive about the experience. All I can do here is basically correlate stuff and basically hope that people will replicate and find the same pattern, right? So, but I just to send the message over with the pre-stimulus, as they call it in cognitive neuroscience, there is a lot of evidence showing that the pre-stimulus alpha is enhancing our capabilities, for example, of being attentive to certain things. So when people have a high pre-stimulus alpha, basically you're going to show them a stimulus and you're going to ask them, where was it, right or left? And people will find it very difficult. But if they had a high alpha before they had to answer this, they will have a significantly better outcome. They will have more success hits. They will have more rights. And I find this really interesting. Okay, so this means that with architecture, could we really enhance any cognitive capacities in that sense? And can we, in that sense, also alter the experience?
Well, wait,
So
can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So how in these experiments, okay, so the architect, or designs the field in which then this person or these people experience, right? So the architect has designed these, but okay, but if the architect only always designs the field, how can, I guess what I'm understanding, the correlation is always going to be there, that there's this surge of awareness or learning or focus or whatever you're talking about, this activity in the brain approaching anything novel in any environment. So, but it's based in the organisms. It's always going to be based, if you had a frog go through it, or again, like a fish or a bird, it's always going to be the organism's response to it. And how can you, so how is there going to be ever going to be a causal conclusion?
There's also a question from Luis. I don't know if you want to answer now, Zakaria.
No, but I think that it comes back to the question of causality and correlation. And I'm sorry, Lily, as much as I really would love to discuss that with you, I think that it's just outside the scope of this talk. It would be a very long conversation, and I'm not sure that people will get anything designed.
I mean, the more you talk about it, you can always do correlation. You can always prove correlation. I can always go, every time I turn on the light, people jump. You're always going to have that. But how are you ever going to be able to go in the opposite direction? So I'm waiting for that moment, but I feel like it's never going to come. but I'm just wondering about that. That, like, how do you ever get to the causality?
Well, yeah, I think that's a good question, and I would just want to remind people to just keep scribbling about the fish and the bird.
Yeah, I'm doing it in my mind.
Just to remind. Good, great.
It's a great way to start. I love this whole talk. You have no idea. Like,
awesome. I'm glad. I think Luis has a question.
Luis has a question. Yes.
Can you hear me very well, or
yes,
more or less? Because sometimes my microphone wasn't working correctly. I hope you can hear me. So I'm an architect, so I have a lot of questions about this. I try to understand everything you just show us, which is very, very interesting. I have just one question about the affordances and the way you perceive it and what you're expecting for when you see these let's say the narrow door. So let's say that you show a narrow door and somehow you have a reaction towards what's happening or what's coming next. And if you feel this could be pleasant or not, but I'm wondering more about what if you change what's coming next, because you have an expectation of what's coming next. No, let's say if I see a narrow door, I might imagine the space that I will encounter will be narrower or is becoming narrow, and somehow this experience will alert me to react to a certain way for the action I'm taking to my next step once the door is open. Yes. So what happens if the next situation, the next space is wider, and then it changed completely my mind of what I'm expecting? So in this sense, what I'm trying to understand is we can persuade of what's coming next in a space that we see. So somehow architects, we try to play with this game. Sometimes we want to first show a very narrow space and suddenly it opens and then you have this idea of grandeur and then you are stimulating our brain to make a surprise or make a mystery moment like the Kaplans once mentioned in the cognitive psychology. So I'm wondering more like this, what is it with your studies when you change the idea of what's coming next, when it is not the response that you will recognize when it's a narrow space. Let's say if I see the narrow door, I go to a narrow space, but no. Did you already make some experiments about the contrary of what happened of what you were coming next? I'm not sure if I was clear.
I think I understand. You will have to correct me.
Okay.
I think that this has a lot to do with associations. And I just want to remind you that I'm still talking about the implicit grasp, right? So the unconscious processes. I'm not asking people to consciously like tell me, and I'm not trying to tell me what type of door is this. I'm not trying to tell them that. The only thing that I told them is that you have to get to the other space to touch this red circle that is floating in the air, and then you have to come back. And if you can't, then you just turn around and you start around. You restart the trial. This is all I told them. So I'm trying to like just, and of course, I completely agree that I definitely did not succeed in coming up with a paradigm that completely isolates the unconscious process. But I'm getting very close there, at least I feel, especially when we talk about processes that happens at 50 to 60 milliseconds, right? So what you're asking is, if I understand correctly, Luis, is whether there is an association between the type of transition and the space that comes after.
Yes.
And I think that's a great question, and we should totally figure that out. I have not tested that.
I would love to hear that. I would love to know what happened next, and even
It's
if
a
we
good
change
question.
the expectation, we completely surprise the user for the next space. So thank you.
I
very
must
much.
say that if I have to give a qualified answer, and maybe it's not that qualified, but I think that the human being as an organism is basically, so when we are attuned to the world, we use affordances, right? So for me, the task to pass through the door to get to the other space, whatever the state of that space may be, it has nothing to do with the transition. So in my opinion, there might not be that kind of association. There might be something about the task of going through, but the experience of the next space is less related to the passing. You know what I mean? Because I think that we are practically oriented. In that sense, I wouldn't expect any differences in the way that we perceive the upcoming space.
Zakaria,
Yeah. Can I just have one tiny little question that I think you would answer for me, and I've always wondered about this, and I love the whole brainwave thing. Subconscious versus unconscious. What's the difference?
I think that's okay. Yeah, let's go there. Subconscious, in my opinion, has, as far as I've read from Freud and the rest of the literature following his philosophies, has way more to do with, let's say, deeper meanings that you can find and that refer to some events that has happened in your life in that sense. Unconscious processes are processes that are not conscious. It's simply that, right? So a lot of things are happening right now around me, my wife sitting here and stuff, but I'm not conscious of her, but I'm unconsciously understanding that she is there. There's an implicit grasp of my environment, and I know that it's there because I know I know what motor actions, what motor programs to execute in order to get her into my perception. I simply turn my head. And then this unconscious process allows me to become conscious of it. And I'm not going to dig deeper into this because this is a very, very difficult topic. Otherwise, I would love to hear your opinion about the difference between subconscious and unconscious. And then I will get back to the next experiment.
Zakaria, I would just like to one question, because I'm still thinking about the narrow door. And imagine if you would have had a bigger scope of subjects or of people in your experiences, and you would find a person who probably since childhood was really interested and would enjoy very much to be challenged. maybe that person would have a very different response to the narrow door and wouldn't see the narrow door as a frustrating obstacle, but would see it as an affordance for a positive and rewarding challenge. Just as an example, this to give you a concrete example of why I think that, and also picking up some threads from what Louise was saying, that we in architecture, we can compose a space, we have a narrower space or something like that gives a more feeling of confinement, of tunnel and so on. And then we can kind of give the user this kind of feeling of release. So from tension to relaxation and so on. But this is also how a composer thinks. And we know that not everyone has the same taste in music. Some people love classical music and some people love hard rock music, and even in the hard rock there's or softer, and so there's all these different layers.
Yes.
So how can we transport this to architecture?
I think that is a very, very good question, and I also should be very clear about that. I think that's my mistake. So I'm definitely not claiming that this has anything to do with what people conceive as beauty, like beautiful, or in that sense even pleasurable, or at all. What I'm trying to target here
or
is
meaningful,
or even not even meaningful in that sense. It's just practically meaningful, and that is exactly what affordances are, right? They are the meaning. Affordances are in that sense definitely in the ecological psychology literature. You will find that affordances are the meaning, that is the information that you're looking for in the environment. That is what you pick up. But in that sense, I should be very clear about that I'm not looking into these deeper meanings in that sense. But I will come to a claim in just a second after this slide, which I think you might find a kind of an answer to your question. So just to continue real quick. Basically, what I did was start to analyze the frequencies of the brain. And as I said, and analyzing neural oscillations while approaching doors of different affordances. So now I'm looking literally at the moment that the people start walking and reach the door, right? And basically, yeah, so basically, this is maybe easier to show. Basically, people are standing as the lights go on, and they're immobile. They're just standing there. They're waiting for the second cue, which tells them whether the door is green, which means you can walk towards the door, or if it turns red, which means you have to restart the trial. Let's say they get a green door and they start getting mobile. They start moving, and then they get to the threshold. This is where the door happens. This is just a section, you could say. And basically, what I analyze here is what I contrast here is the mobile situation. And basically what I find in the mobile situation, from the moment that they walk until the moment that they actually cross this threshold, which is here, I find differences in the alpha frequency. And you can see here that it says from 8 to around 15 in this case. And these differences are super, super clear. Again, what does this even mean for architecture? Well, what I'm saying here is that you have a stronger alpha oscillation, stronger alpha activity before you enter the next space. This is what I'm saying. And what we learned from these studies here is that if you alter the pre-stimulus alpha, you will have an effect on their cognitive capacities. So in a sense that this may not be all that radical in that sense, what I'm saying then. That this means that architecture has the capacity to alter frequencies that are correlated with cognitive capacities. So this raises an interesting question. Am I saying here then that we should definitely start designing spaces that are difficult to enter? It's not what I'm saying, but this is what the studies are implying. But in fact, I'm saying the exact opposite. I'm saying that if alpha is correlated with attention, then we might suspect that people are becoming aware or more attentive of their space when they cannot pass. Is that really what you want as an architect? That's not what you want. You want the space to be effortlessly experienced. You want the space to aid you. You do not want people to become conscious. And this is the radical claim that I would like to state here as I'm coming towards the end.
I disagree. I completely disagree with you.
I love it. It's good. I love it.
I would give you a very concrete example, because I'm also teaching ergonomics. And I come also from this paradigm as an architect and performance artist. I'm very interested in the somatic body. So I'm very interested in these techniques like Feldenkrais and Alexander technique and so on, that basically teach you how to harness your own body so that you can better support yourself. And this is a lot of these techniques are used, for example, in physiotherapy. And of course, there's a lot of debate around this, in how far a lot of the instruments we have in our environment, which are supposed to help us or to aid us, so to make our life easier, in the long run, might actually compromise the body's resilience, because we are so used of getting all sorts of help that we lose the capacity for supporting ourselves. We lose muscular tonus, we lose resilience. So we experience a lot of this through, for example, air conditioning environments, lack of contact with nature, sitting for too long, for example. So in how far is this really desirable that we have? I think that perhaps we evolved as we evolved because we had to face so many challenges.
No, but don't misunderstand me. I completely agree with you. In fact, I'm working. Do you know Julio Bermudez?
No.
No, he is an amazing professor of architecture at the Catholic University in Washington, and basically working on this neuroaesthetic of contemplative states. It's an amazing field that he's basically giving life to now. And in my very deep discussions with him, I've learned a lot. And this is where I want to make the distinction. I think that if you create a space that you want to be a space where people learn, for example, a classroom, you need to create a space that fosters learning environment. You don't need to challenge people in the way that you learn. You don't need to make super bad acoustics in order to challenge the way that the sensory system understands what's happening in the environment. You know what I mean? So this has to do with, what does the architect want? What does the architect want to shape? So if you want to create a space that fosters and furnishes contemplative states, spiritual states, then yes, for sure, you need to create environments that enforces you to reinterpret the way that your sensory and motor system are interlaced. This will create an implicit awareness about your attunement to the world.
But shouldn't that be an individual experience?
It is. Now I'm just giving you the notes now, like you said before with the music, right? And like composers. Well, here is definitely one way that you can compose.
I mean, we can go to religion, for example, and we know how in the history of religions, buildings were used also as a way to reinforce the narrative and to give certain physical sensational experiences that reinforced the narrative, and in some ways kind of conducted the experience of this kind of community body which is there. But in how far is this related to, for example, personal meaning?
Well, I think that's a difficult question because I think that the personal meanings are something that are very different. I don't even know personally, and I have to admit that this is something I'm struggling with. Can any embodied processes ever reflect personal meaning? I'm not sure.
Oh, wait,
I'm not sure. I think that perhaps personal meanings are private and inaccessible by any measures.
Yes, Zach, but the challenge you gave us in the beginning was, how do we create a home for a bird, for example? So if we wanted to foster their personal narrative, we would give them a tree and a bunch of sticks.
Would you?
Well, we might, if given that that the birds create their own nest, we would provide the field of awareness for which they can consciously.
No, yeah, I'm listening. Sorry, I'm just moving forward to the birds and the fish or bird. Sorry.
Well, because that was my idea. My idea was that I would foster a bird's home by giving them a tree and some sticks and some cotton.
Yeah, of course, and I think that's a very sympathetic thought. But once you actually have to put that into paper,
a raven mother, because I would just let the birds figure it out for themselves.
Yeah, but this is a design. This is a design challenge. You need to scribble something on a piece of paper. You need to come up with something concrete. You need to actually draw lines on a piece of paper. Once you have to do that,
I drew a nest. I drew a nest that the birds are going to create from my field of awareness.
Yeah,
that I'm going to create for them.
Well, I think so. So basically, the questions that I was hoping that people could answer is that what was the first thing that came to their mind? Is there even a front door if you have to design something for a bird? Are there windows in that piece of building or nest that you want to create for them? And did you even consider their beauty standards? I mean, there are so many aspects to this when you have to draw something for different type of species. And when I give this task to students, I find it really interesting that when you have different affordances, so the birds can fly up, and they usually live in the air, right? They live in the trees, and fish, they live in the water, and they have different affordances. So I would personally expect that if I had to design like a luxury home for a bird, I would probably create a front door in the bottom, like in the floor, a big hole in the floor, and the bird would basically fly into it like that. That could be like one way. But for a fish, perhaps it should be on the top. And already here, we're fostering different design solutions because of the body of the organism. And I think that it's completely crazy that when we design for human beings, we don't really understand human beings. And we see that a lot with very bad design that do not take the human body and the capacities of the human organism into account. And this is what I was hoping that people would understand once they had to design something for a completely different organism with completely different patterns of action, a completely different conception of the world, perception of the world.
Zakaria, just one more log into the discussion. And
yeah.
Because this also has to do with needs, and because you are mentioning like making this ideal environment or creating a luxurious environment where the bird or the user or whatever really wants to be and wants to stay. But couldn't it happen that at some point the organism would get bored, and then the needs and the desires and the expectations would also change, and the perception of the affordances would change?
Yes, definitely. So once you learn to perceive the world in a different way, and we see that a lot with visual illusions. So some people cannot see, usually these bistable images, some people cannot see the other stability. And once they get taught that you can actually see this, then it cannot be unseen. And I think this is something, a lesson you can learn, because once you learn to use something in a new way, you perceive it in a different way now.
Exactly.
Yes. Yes, I completely agree with that. And again, it comes.
I just mean it at this point because I think a lot about affordances in terms of architecture, also from the point of view of sustainability. And we know nowadays that basically if we continue building, we are really responsible for the massive carbon footprint we have. There's a lot of responsibility from building industry. There's a problem with the concrete, what's done with the concrete, and also with steel. So if we think about affordances also in terms of the built environment in general,
Mm-hmm.
and how we are already so conditioned by culture and all factors to perceive things in a certain way, wouldn't it be really important to start picking up on affordances exactly in this way as something that you can harness to teach you how you can see things from a different perspective and use them in a different perspective?
Yes, definitely. But I think that I completely agree with you. But I think that relates a bit more to the process of design, right? Am I understanding this correctly?
No, I meant to the process of use of the building. Of course,
So
you can design that. You can, as an architect or as a designer, propose this other use. But you as a user can also do it yourself. In fact, people do it all the time. And this is normally the sign when the design has failed, because people don't use it that way.
Yes, I completely agree. So there's something about certain designs that can invite certain behavior. And I think that this is like, if you are an artist or a designer who's able to create new ways of interacting with either the space or an object or parts of space, then you have certain skills. You are a very skillful architect or designer in my view, because inviting to different ways of use is something that has to do with breaking the habits of a person. And I think habits are extremely powerful. And if you force someone to reinterpret the way that they can interact with the world, you're literally changing the way that they understand the world.
Yes.
So if you have that capacity, if you have that skill as a designer, you are really talented, and we need you.
Or you're really interfering also but there's also in neuroscience the whole debate of free will. Anyway, I think we should definitely now challenge our students to make some.
I want to see some drawings.
I think David wanted to say something because he turned his camera on. Quickly, I will change here my view.
Maybe I should stop sharing my screen too.
Yes, please, Zach.
Yeah, sorry.
Then I can have an overview. So please, this is your space. We are having this discussion, this conversation for you. And I'm sure that you have a lot of questions going on in your heads.
So I have one question. So to be honest, the last 10 minutes were probably the most important part for me because I didn't understand anything about the data, to be honest. I'm so sorry. But I think actually the last sheet you showed us, what do people need? What do certain groups of user need to interact with architecture is probably the most important thing. Actually, I do take I take with me. But I have one question to the data. The first graph you showed us, it was the blue, the green, not green, the yellow and the red, I think. And the yellow and the red were the ones for where you said that the peak is not as different as the blue one. How do you see this? Because for me, the blue seemed pretty, actually pretty common, or it doesn't look that much different to the other one. So just a little bit of background probably for me would be great.
Yeah, well, it has to do with averaging and statistics, and basically what you looked at was the grand average of a particular channel, and I could have shown you the occipital channels, so the OZ, for example, and you would see a much stronger difference visually. I could alter the visual difference if I just extended the distance between the units along my y-axis, and then it would look visually like a lot. But in this case, I just show it with the standard units. Because that's like the literature decides that, and you just go with it. But statistically, you will see that there is a very significant difference. Okay. And I'm glad that you picked that up. Actually, that the first thing that you said, that because basically what I really want to emphasize here is that there is a lot of unconscious processing that is anchored in our affordances of space that we just do not need to be conscious of because they're handled. And we know how to be conscious of them if we need to, right? So this is like the main point that I want to convey today. This is the message of what I want to say. A lot of unconscious sensory motor processing that are implicitly altering the way that we experience the space. The question is how. I'm not sure yet, and this is, I apologize for that, but I'm just a postdoc.
But these are, it's a wonderful input, Zakaria, because it really brings all these questions and all these topics that are really interesting in the discussion. And I think also for our students, it's probably the first time that they were confronted with this kind of knowledge. So I am sure that they have so many questions. Please.
Maybe even none questions, because it's too much new information. Like this guy's just talking.
Yeah. What I also found very interesting was the correlation between affordances and the oscillations in the brain, because the way I sometimes understand these oscillations also just coming from a more psychological view, like if we anticipate affordances in, I say, jobs or how we interact with people, that like can trigger us to feel stress. And I think like stress also is a different oscillation in the brain. So I found this like very like how we interact as people according to affordances, and then also see this in the way we interact with the space. Very interesting.
Mm. I'm glad you liked it, but I also have to say that my personal opinion about frequencies and cognitive capacities is that our language is just not suitable to talk about whatever these frequencies are doing, because they sort of pop up in very different behaviors, you know. and they have very different relations. So you can have coupling between slow frequencies and high frequencies. And right now, I think that the winning theory about that coupling has to do with understanding expectations versus sensory processing. And I think that although this is very interesting theory about what happens, what does these frequencies mean in the brain and why are they there? I don't think that we have the language to actually start talking about what are they doing. But at least architecture can contribute now.
Mm.
So architecture can alter these frequencies, and this is what I find fascinating.
But is like the goal to kind of find, okay, in the human organism, what is like for us an environment that enhances us in a positive way, in a way that it's like also for different people as they're personally primed to perceive the space and to sort of see, okay, what's the space that's definitely not working in a positive way for all of the humans. So sort of like figure out a range.
Could be, but I have to admit, the goal, yeah, what is that? I'm not sure yet what is my goal with all this, because I think that it's just like an endless rabbit tunnel, you know. It's just you just continue going there, and it can just you will I don't know. But I love your perspective, though. I think that you have an interesting perspective on it.
I've got another question. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really fascinating. While you were talking about all the stuff that you found out, I was wondering in the end, because we actually had a course this afternoon where we talked about that as well, that architecture is not really a scientific kind of way, that there's no really a science behind architecture, and it's basically, or at least for now, it's more like everybody's doing what they think is the right path, and there's not this one way to go. But what I was wondering now, with your studies and what you found out, is there actually, or are you kind of like in the process of beginning to understand how, or in another way, what is the right path? So you talked about the different types of doors and how and what parts of the brain actually corresponded to that. So is there, in the big picture, is there probably a way that we can like figure out a right way for architecture just by using or seeing what the brain does in certain areas?
I think that what I'm approaching now is more an understanding of the human body and brain, and of course I'm by far not an expert at all on the brain as such. I'm just interested in the interaction with the environment, and I think that I'm coming to a conclusion, or at least approaching a conclusion, that has to do with the human body, the organism, the brain and the body, and also the interaction with the environment is inherently practical. So I'm not sure that we will ever find any kind, I don't think it's the goal to find any spaces that will create a positive response in that sense. I just don't think that there is like this golden ratio of a space or even a transition that will create this type of experience. I think that it has to do with the interaction between what does the human body and the human organism want? What do you want, right? Because you can be in the most beautiful space, but if you just had a breakup or something just terrible, that space will just not feel that good. And the space is not going to change that. But I think that the underlying sensory motor processes that are happening can have a small effect on the way that you're going to make decisions about certain things. And this is why I keep emphasizing the continuous experience, right? Because we never really have a certain state of mind directly associated with a certain space. It's not like a space can induce a certain state in you in that sense. It can perhaps approach certain states. If it's a cold space, then most likely, depending on what you're wearing, right, you will start to freeze. This is one state. But whatever you have in mind in terms of experience, it's very difficult to correlate to those two things. So again, I think that I'm starting at least to coming up with a framework here where we can start to investigate it empirically. and still there are a lot of difficulties. And actually, I saw that Michael Arbib is here too, and I had the honor of reading part of his book, and I think that there are different approaches to the way that we understand the experience of architecture, and I definitely think that Michael Arbib's perspective is intriguing. It's super interesting, and I think that any architect who reads it will completely take their understanding of how we interact with the environment upside down. It will completely turn it. So I think that there are different ways that we can approach architecture empirically, but we're definitely getting there. I mean, things are starting to boil up, and I really hope that some of you guys, the students, will also find this interesting and jump in on the research.
Zakaria, just one point here, because we know, for example, from some we could say design typologies, for example, theme parks. These are places which are very skillfully designed to create specific experiences. And they tend to work. I mean, people go with a certain expectation to have these thrills and so on, and it works. And in many ways, in terms of commercial spaces, we also know that the lighting and everything kind of guides us and can induce kind of manipulatively that we spend there more time. So if we spend there more time, we see more beautiful things. So eventually we will spend more money there. So in some ways, this is a system that already works. My point is, in terms of architecture, in how far can we use this in a way that it's desirable? Do you understand what I mean?
I'm not entirely sure, but I think what I probably need first is if you could elaborate on what you mean by those design features are works. I mean, that they can induce certain experiences, because to be honest with you, I'm not sure that anyone has ever had the same experience twice.
No, I mean in a very general sense. You know, for example, if you go, there's a theme park near Hollywood called Universal Studios. Yes, exactly, Universal Studios. Yeah. And I was always completely against theme parks. I read Baudrillard's work on theme parks and so on. But I was there and I was curious and I wanted to go through this experience. And this is an environment which is completely designed to give you very specific sensations of, you experience fear, you experience anxiety, you experience some points of relief because you can also buy things and so on. So on a very crude level, your experience as a human is composed because you go through these rooms, for example, or so, that work with the features like the lighting and so on. It's already prepared in a way that it activates you. Yeah. And I'm sure that they work with people who know about the brain to trigger in you specific responses. And then, of course, you want to escape, like these escape rooms, for example. Yeah. Yeah. These are spaces that are composed in such a way. So my question is, in how far shall we really interfere consciously with this process? In how far would this really bring benefits?
I mean, you mean like interfere with these processes as architects?
Yes.
Yes. I think that if you have a palette and you're a painter, the more colors you have, the more rich experience you can create with your painting. So in this sense, I think that you as an architect needs to settle with yourself. What kind of experiences are you looking to create, right? So you need to create like this narrative. You need to compose the experience of spaces. And I think that to some degree, no matter how much you want to compose certain experiences, you cannot create the exact experience that you want.
Yes.
I don't think that this is possible ever. And again, it comes down to the idea again of continuous experience, because like Heraclitus, he would say, right, the man who dipped in the river, when he came back up, he was not the same man as he was before he dipped in, and neither is the river. Everything is in constant change, and I don't think that it's possible to induce the same experience twice. I think that you can come close to certain experiences, but I don't think that, so in forcing certain experiences, right, you are also removing a lot, and you're removing flexibility, and you are removing the possibility of creating new exciting experiences. On the other hand, if you just create a big room where everything can happen, you are creating too much flexibility, too chaotic, and no precise experience of that space. But in the end, I think no matter what you choose to do as an architect, it's up to you. There's definitely an ethical question. I'm just providing the tools here.
But this is a brilliant answer. That's exactly. This is a brilliant.
I'm just telling you that you can create certain experiences by thinking in time. I think this is the most important thing. I keep repeating myself here. You need to think in time. You need to think that if you want to create certain experience of that space, you need to understand, how do I even approach it? And even before I get to the part where I approach it, how do I approach that? And you can continue like that. So the experience of that space, when does it start? It starts now. You know what I mean? It starts right now. The next experience it starts right now. You're building up certain experiences and expectations. All of these prior expectations are all building up to that experience if this is what you want to design.
Accepting that the user might at some point always change them, because the needs and the expectations change. But
exactly,
I don't want to trap you in the same loop over and over. But this was a brilliant answer. It was exactly the answer I was for a long time trying to get from you. Okay.
Great.
More input.
Well, I actually don't really have like that question, because as you already said, like for me, the whole field of like this whole science field is completely new for me, and I don't know a lot about how the brain works, and also I don't know a lot about how architecture works actually, because what I really liked, I just wanted to thank you for the presentation, because I find it like incredibly interesting. But what really helped me is that you said that you had like an engineering background also, and that's something that I also have, and what I think is also like incredibly interesting, that you have like the engineering side that I, for example, in my bachelor's had too, and now I'm in urban design and urban planning. Like I changed for my master's, and to get that together sometimes is also really interesting, because you have like the artsy side, and like art and design is really like that field, and then you have like the engineering side. But I also like, since I heard of that you really can, like your brain reacts to like urban design, or like the city you're walking in, or like the architecture, and that you really can like influence that. I think it's like incredibly interesting, and I think there's not a lot, or like I don't know of a lot of research from that. So I think it's incredibly interesting that you gave us like that insights on how the brain really reacts, and how you can shape the environment, and how the body like really reacting to it. And I think it's really interesting, and I wanted to thank you for that, because it really motivates me also to like get deeper into that field. And also when I finish like my studies and be like an urban designer, urban planner, that I really have that always like in the back of my mind, that I shape the environment and that all the people react to it. And also like the drawing exercise was really helpful, because it really like I exactly had that reaction, like oh yeah, I didn't at all design the houses like for the fish needs. So it's really interesting. Thanks a lot for that.
I'm glad that you liked it, and I find it really interesting that you also mentioned so the urban theory part. Actually, this is something that I really wanted to show you guys, but I was not sure whether there was time for that. I'm just going to quickly share my screen and show you. I promise. Last diagram. Yeah. So basically, in terms of urban theory, and I was thinking a lot about this, because so the argument is also that, okay, Zach, we're not always inside rooms. It's not always going to have an impact on us, the interior. That's true. But also, I'm talking about the general environment, even when you are in urban spaces. And in this case here, I'm basically contrasting the Times Square, which has very rigid lines, sidelines, and very planned. This is a consequence of modernism, unfortunately. And then I contrast it with Copenhagen, that has naturally evolved as the city basically grew. And here I show the differences. Here you have very sharp corners. So you start from here, you walk there, you get to it's a section of 2 lines, and we continue. At that trajectory, the amount of new sensory information that you're getting about the space at the turn of a corner is incredibly steep. You have very high velocity of new information. But if you are in a space that has very slow turns, let's call them slow turns, the amount of new information is really controlled and very slow. This has a lot of implications for the way that we understand sensory motor interactions, right? So this type of let's call this a type of perspective, that this way of looking at things. This is my glass. If you wear them and you look at it like that, you will start understanding that there's a lot happening unconsciously by the sensory motor cortex, always affecting other aspects of cognition and human experience, of course. So this was just one thing that I wanted to show you, and I'm not promised I'm not going to show you more of my slides and experimental work. This is also an experiment.
Well, now I have actually a question. So do you have maybe a link of that study, of that urban study? Because it's something I relate a little bit more than in rooms.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
also,
but
yeah,
sorry.
And it's incredibly interesting, because I also think that we as I as urban planner, we plan a lot with spaces that are already there. Like the cities, mostly like in Europe, the cities are built kind of. So it's really interesting how you can interfere with the spaces that, for example, you have shown like Copenhagen, that is already it grew already, and now you have to interfere with the space that already is there. So yeah, it's really interesting, because you can't shape that much new stuff. You just have to work with what is already there and what is already interfering with the body and the brain.
Yeah, exactly. I will share this as soon as I get the paper written and also collected the data and stuff like that. So it's work in progress, but I promise I will send it to Maria, and hopefully she will distribute it to you guys.
Yes, of course. Hannah, just to add a comment on this. We also, because you were mentioning that in the city that we are always mostly working on what is there. But when we do that, we also see that there are so many possibilities that, and I think that if we harness really, if we get this idea of affordances, to really sometimes also take many steps back and kind of forget of how we are used to seeing how we use certain spaces, and see them again from a fresh perspective or a completely different perspective. And instead of thinking that we could demolish this and this and that, maybe we can just propose how to see it and use it differently.
Yes. And I think that sometimes certain designs do that without anyone guiding you, like verbally. Sometimes buildings and certain spaces, objects or whatever, invite you to do that. And I find that really amazing. And I can't stop thinking about what it's exactly what I mean, Maria. It's exactly what you said. It's the fact that sometimes if you just take a lot of steps back and you try to understand exactly how, it's not only the affordances, it's literally how our sensations about the world are being molded by the way that we interact with something. And if you start focusing on that and you start reinterpreting that, you will start to find new ways of interacting with that environment, right? Or that object or whatever you're interacting with. But this requires some kind of intention by the person. And I think that sometimes this is internally induced, as Julio Bermudez would say. What we need is externally induced reinterpretation. And I think this is something that really, this is a strong idea, in my opinion, about how certain experiences can be reinterpreted.
But that means that you would be dependent on an external agent to induce you that...
No, the environment itself.
Yeah, but the environment is shaped by someone who is doing that decision. But what about, now again I come with a difficult question, but what about self-determination? What if we want actually to empower the user? And when I say user, I don't make a distinction between user and architect, because the architect is also a user. Yeah. But the architect can also empathize with the capacity of the user to make that shift in perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I completely agree.
So I think that this capacity to go on a middle level, if you would like to say it like that, and detach and go on this middle level, is also something that can be learned, maybe in education, and so that you actually empower people to have the capacity to do that without necessarily the interference of an external agent.
Yes, yeah, of course, I completely agree. Some people are just basically inclined to be that way already from the very beginning. And I think that they will have certain experiences that people who are not like that will not have.
Okay.
I'm not sure whether an architect can have an impact on that, other than just trying to be inviting in the way that they design spaces or objects.
Okay, more questions. I think Ono would like to say something because he turned the camera on and off a few times.
That's the cue.
No? Maybe it was for a moment and then it's gone.
My connection is just bad, sorry.
We can hear you.
We can hear you, yes. Zach, I don't know, how are you with time? Is this still okay, or is it?
No, it's fine. I'm probably just gonna work on an experiment afterwards anyway. So.
I have maybe like a general question. I don't know. It's maybe not really with the theme, but as you said that you studied like architecture also and engineering, like how did you get into that field of like science about the brain and how the brain functions, like doing these experiments? Because like I don't know a lot of people, like most people I know that study architecture, they just become like architects and build houses. And maybe like do a little bit of research on like how houses are built or like materials or something. But how do you like get into that field of science that is like so much psychological or like also neurological? So,
well, I will try to make a long story short. Basically, it started when I went to Japan, and I realized how very elementary stuff, elementary designs are completely baffled me. I mean, I was completely overwhelmed. Like the fact that the handrails were very low, the doors were very low, stuff like that, and even the smells in the city. All of these things that I never experienced, and now I live in Denmark, but I'm originally from Algeria, North Africa. So I mean, I'm used to differences in cultures, but not something as much as the Far East of Asia. So there I realized, okay, there's something interesting about that. And then I have some kind of love for surrealism. I've always had that. So during my master's, I always took point of departure in surrealism and the Second Manifesto. And of course, that sort of led me to work with Pavlovian conditioning, and that's what I wrote in my my master thesis, which when I read now is very embarrassing because I did not know anything, and I felt like I knew a lot. So I started working with conditioning and spaces. So basically, spaces that condition you as you go from one space to another. And my supervisor really liked it, and he said, "Well, why don't you come and work with us?" And I figured out that if you work with physics and stuff like free energy principle and active inference, they literally use the same language we do in engineering. So it's very convenient to start working with algorithms that use the same language you use in engineering, and you feel okay, this is more home. So, and of course, then you have a big problem because then you're entangling philosophy, the immeasurable, and physics, the measurable, and this fight continues inside me.
Now, because I also got a little bit curious, you mentioned this with the conditioning, then I would say that probably a performance artist or someone who thinks from this perspective of performance art is the biggest nightmare of these theories. Because basically what we do with performance art is to kind of understanding how these habits and also how buildings and how sometimes institutions and so on, they condition us to act and to think in a certain way. But these processes of conditioning can be really limiting because at some point what they can do is to imprint very specific narratives and ways of behaving that are very consciously shaping a lot of human behavior. So having had the experiences of what happened, for example, in totalitarian systems, how can we be sure that now with neuroscience we don't fall in the same direction?
There is a good chance that we might. And this is why I think that the way that we do these experiments, they really need to be thought through. And it's one thing that I hate is looking into experiments that did not think into terms of causality and correlation, like Lily wanted to discuss before, which I still really would love to engage her with. But I think that it's very difficult to not fall into trap, and therefore we need to think in ways where we take into consideration all of these. I mean, we need to learn from history, obviously. So we need to be very careful in the way that we, first of all, design the experiments, and second of all, the way that we interpret these experiments. And in that sense, I am personally a huge fan of establishing a hypothesis before I begin, because I think that as soon as you have a hypothesis, you have a point of departure in a larger theory. And this is what I think is important. So as long as you know that this theory is not counterintuitive with the existing literature and also with prior history, of course, then you have a good point of departure. And even that might be too naive. So it has a lot to do with the way that we construct our experiments and the way that we interpret them. And I completely agree with you. There's a good chance that we might fall into some kind of cognitivism again. I mean, it's definitely a possibility. This is why I think that people should, scientists should not just do empirical experiments, but also engage in the philosophical debates.
Michael, you.
Yeah, I'm just very puzzled at this sort of worry about a totalitarian impulse. I mean, let's just take a very practical decision. You're designing a restaurant for McDonald's, or you're designing a restaurant for a fine establishment. In one case, you want to know enough about humans to figure out how they can comfortably find their way to the counter, order their food quickly, be encouraged to consume it comfortably but quickly, and leave, so more customers will come in. In the other case, you're trying to decide affordances for people to find their way to a table with flowers, ambient lighting that is attractive, that will encourage them to linger over the meal, savor a fine food, buy wine, and leave with a large tip on a large bill, feeling they've had a satisfactory evening. These, in either case, you're learning about how to affect two types of behavior: fast food restaurant versus fine dining restaurant. You're providing affordances and atmosphere that will be different in the two cases. That's not totalitarian. You wouldn't go into the fine dining restaurant if you wanted to buy a hamburger. You wouldn't go into McDonald's if you wanted steak au poivre and a good bottle of red wine. So I don't think this attempt, whether it involves psychology or just post-occupancy evaluation, or trying to look at the underlying neuroscience mechanisms, as Zach is doing, why in any way that should intersect a concern about totalitarians. We can certainly think about ways totalitarians could use anything like this. The Gestapo could design a room for torture and interrogation using this, but that's not the point here. The point here is, how can we better understand how users will experience spaces so that we can provide them with the experience that we get in the program for a building that we're given as architects.
I would like to comment on that. I think that's a brilliant point. So a couple of things. I know that McDonald's, for instance, they have a huge handbook. If you want to build a McDonald's building, they have a huge handbook for how you should design their building. For example, there's a certain height of that M, the golden M, that you have to place it if you place it near a highway, because they want it to be at the exact height that kids can see from the back seat, so they can tell their parents, we need to get some hamburgers, some Happy Meals. I'm not kidding. There's scientific evidence of this. And this is like how and of course this is inevitable. You always find someone who exploits these type of results, which reminds me of Mussolini. Like, there is 17 meters, huge space that he's sitting in his office, a huge space, a very little desk at the very far end of this huge space. It makes you feel so small when you have to walk these 17 meters from the front door all the way to the office. Of course, this is a clear exploitation of human behavior, human capacities. And I'm afraid that this is inevitable. Actually, I was approached by some neuromarketing guys that wanted to investigate, well, how do we, what happens in the brain when you place products up here versus down here and stuff like that. And I had to say, guys, I'm not going to do this because this is like in conflict with my personal ethics. I don't want to engage in this kind of like give more.
We just have the example of Facebook. And we know it's clear and it's an open discussion. I mean, we see it with social networks. They were designed to work with our very simple mechanisms of reward and punishment. And this is exploited in the way that we are constantly consuming these social networks. We are exposed to a lot of information, and this influences our behavior. It shapes culture, and it shapes that, in fact, people become more and more consumers.
You know what? Yeah, I agree with that. And you know what? This is actually how my PhD thesis begins, with a huge speculation about the pyramids. I'm very sure that over trial and error, these architects of the pyramids, they have figured out a lot of interesting capacities of the human behavior. For example, the long ramps that all of these huge pyramids have. I don't think that they're just like a detail that they just wanted to do. They definitely, I bet that they have a much greater thought behind it. I'm very sure they know how to make stairs, but they didn't want to make stairs. They made very long ramps. And it has to do with this anticipation, just like Mussolini, right? As you walk from the very beginning of that ramp all the way to the door or the entrance of the tomb of who is buried behind there, that very long ramp makes you think about a lot of things. It's going to build up a lot of anticipation. This huge person you're going to see there.
A lot of effort.
Yes, exactly. And I think that already
imagine in the desert with the heat.
Exactly, proving the point there. Yeah, exactly. I think that there's a lot of ideas that has already been started back then, and we're just slowly rediscovering them now. And unfortunately, there will always be some kind of totalitarian exploitation of these results. It's just like I think it was Hannah who said it. She doesn't know how architecture works. I'm guilty as charged too. I don't know how architecture works. This is why I'm doing this type of research. I really have no idea. I'm only learning.
But Zakaria, not to continue this forever, although it's always a temptation, but I know you still have an experiment to do today. Yes. I think that what's really interesting is that now with these tools, we as architects also have the opportunity to think about these questions and to think about, because for example, in the medical profession, there's very clear codes of ethics, in the architectural profession also, but on a different level. So I think that this will really force the profession of the architect to question these new knowledge, and when it can bring very, very deeply, and to start working on ethics in this regard.
Yeah, could be. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So I'm very happy that I can contribute with these tools, and I hope that also the students are getting some ideas from this talk, which I find personally very interesting.
I think so too. I think they're very stimulated. Would you like to add something else or make another question?
I don't have any more questions, although I have a comment perhaps. The picture behind you with all those transitions, that looks like Fåborg Museum in Denmark, drawn by Carl Peterson.
You mean that one there?
No, the one up to your right. Maybe that's your left, my right. The transitions.
Which one do you mean? Ah, no, that's Goethe's house.
Aha, okay. It looks a lot like Fåborg Museum by Carl Peterson, Danish architect, very famous museum.
He might have made a reference to Goethe. You know,
looks like it.
Goethe is one of the fathers of color theory. He was very interested in how color perception would interfere with our influence our mood and our behavior. So he did these color experiments in this house to kind of put it to practice. And yeah, and I find it a really interesting space.
I love the space. Yeah, the fact that it's a lot of transitions. I don't know. I got this thing for transitions. I'm sorry.
No, you don't have to be sorry, because I also have a very strong interest in transitions. Also from the performative aspect, because recently I started to train and to practice in a kind of performance art which is called Buto. and it comes from Japan, and it works with very, very slow movements, exactly to induce this kind of in-between state of conscious and unconscious. And once you can access this mode, you're into kind of this space of transition, and your body feels very responsive, and you can kind of explore also from a performative approach, not necessarily the affordances that you are used to perform in the environment, but something else that comes up. So
Awesome.
if you're curious, I would recommend you.
Yeah, definitely. No, I'm really getting interested. Just after my long discussions with Julio Bermudez, I've been really, really interested in contemplative and states and mindfulness. It has really, really attracted my interest.
Yeah, then I'm sure you would also be interested in Bhutto.
Yeah, most likely. Yeah.
I recommend you that.
So, okay. So maybe as a final comment here, I just hope that all the students understand that the critical message I wanted to convey is to think in time. Always think in time about how you go from one space to another, and how that prior space is already changing the state in the way that you expect the next space. So there's like this continuity in the way that we experience space, and we have to take that into account to understand how we shape experience. I think that was my last comment.
Okay. Thank you very much, Zakaria. This was a very productive and interesting conversation.
Pleasure was all mine.
I think we all enjoyed a lot all of these threads and ideas and also questions, many questions that appeared. So okay, so I think we could finish for now, and I would like also to thank the members of the audience who took their time to join us, and I think it was also really important to have their input. And so we will say goodbye for now. Thank you, Zakaria, very much. Until next time.
Thank you, guys. It was an absolutely delight to be there. Thank you, guys.
Our pleasure. Bye-bye.
Ciao then. Ciao.
Ciao.
Bye. Thank you.